Before we begin our journey into the shadowy world of organized crime, I must offer a sincere disclaimer. The story you are about to hear is a compilation of facts, historical records, court documents, and publicly available information from various credible sources. It is presented for educational and informational purposes only, with the sole aim of delivering a comprehensive and accurate account to you, the viewer. The intent is not to glorify criminal activity, but to understand the complex persona of a man who became an icon of American crime. Now, if you are ready to delve into a tale of power, vanity, and ultimate downfall, please settle in, and let us begin the story of the man they called the Dapper Don. The story of John Joseph Gotti Jr. is not merely a chronicle of crime, it is a quintessentially American saga, a violent perversion of the immigrant dream set against the grimy, unforgiving backdrop of New York City. He was born on October 27, 1940, in the South Bronx, the fifth of 13 children in a family struggling for its slice of the post-war promise. His parents, John and Fanny Gotti, were poor Italian immigrants, and young John grew up in a world defined by scarcity and the desperate need for respect. The Gottis later moved to East New York, Brooklyn, a neighborhood that served as a crucible for future mobsters, a place where street smarts were valued over book learning and where a young man's reputation was his most valuable currency. From an exceedingly early age, John Gotti displayed a fierce, unyielding temperament and a palpable contempt for authority. He was not interested in the slow, honest toil of his father. He was drawn to the fast money and instant prestige offered by the streets. He dropped out of Franklin K. Lane High School at the age of 16, and by then, he was already a fixture in a local gang known as the Fulton Rockaway Boys, where he quickly earned a reputation for being fearless, ambitious, and brutally effective in street brawls and petty crimes. This gang was his first true family, his first taste of a structured hierarchy outside his home, and it was here that he learned the foundational lessons of his life loyalty to the crew, the power of intimidation, and the intoxicating allure of being someone to be feared. By the late 1950s, Gotti's criminal apprenticeship was in full swing under the tutelage of another rising mobster, Carmen Fatico, who operated a clandestine social club in East New York that served as a front for Gambino family operations. Gotti's duties started small, running errands, acting as a lookout, and participating in hijackings, but his ambition was colossal. It was during this period that he met and forged a lifelong, fateful alliance with two other ambitious young men, Angelo Ruggiero and Wilfred Willie Boy Johnson. This trio would become inseparable, a formidable and reckless crew within the larger mafia framework. Gotti's big break, or perhaps his first major step into the abyss, came in 1968 when he was involved in the accidental kidnapping and murder of a man named Robert DiBernardo, a crime that was initially a botched hijacking. While the legal consequences were minimal due to the mafia's code of silence, the incident cemented his status as a serious, made man within the Gambino family. He was officially made or inducted into the Gambino crime family in the late 1960s, taking his oath of omerta and pledging his life to the organization. His rise was steady, fueled by a relentless work ethic in the criminal underworld and a willingness to use extreme violence that impressed his superiors. He married Victoria Di Giorgio in 1962, and despite his tumultuous life, they would have 5 children together, creating a domestic world that stood in stark contrast to the brutality of his professional one. The 1970s were a decade of consolidation and further ascent for John Gotti. After his induction, he was assigned to the Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens, which would become his primary base of operations and power center for the rest of his life. Under the direct supervision of the powerful underboss Aniello Della Croce, Gotti's crew at the Virgin became one of the most profitable and feared in the entire family. Their criminal portfolio was vast and varied, hijacking trucks from John F. Kennedy Airport, running high-stakes gambling rings, loan sharking, and dealing in narcotics, a technically forbidden but highly lucrative venture that many mobsters secretly engaged in. It was also during this time that Gotti's personal life was marred by tragedy. In 1973, his 12-year-old son, Frank, was killed in a traffic accident when a neighbor, John Favara, accidentally struck the boy with his car. The Gotti family was devastated. A few months later, Favara was clubbed over the head, forced into a van, and never seen again. He was presumed murdered on Gotti's orders, a brutal and chilling demonstration of the mobster's capacity for vengeance that sent a clear message to the entire city about the kind of man John Gotti was, a man whose grief translated into terminal violence, a man whose power and rage now extended far beyond the boundaries of the underworld and into the quiet streets of his own neighborhood. The disappearance of John Favara was not just an act of vengeance. It was a stark, public declaration that John Gotti was a law unto himself, a man whose personal tragedies and professional vendettas were settled not in courts of law, but in the brutal, final court of the street. This event cast a long, dark shadow over his rising stature, marking him as not just another gangster, but a figure of almost mythical ruthlessness. While the Favara case simmered in the background, a source of dark whispers, Gotti's criminal career continued its meteoric ascent under the protective and approving wing of Aniello Della Croce. The 1970s for Gotti were a grinding, relentless accumulation of power and wealth. His base, the Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club, was a deceptively shabby storefront that belied the immense criminal enterprise it commanded. From this unassuming headquarters, Gotti and his loyal crew, including his childhood friends Angelo Ruggiero and Wilfred Willie Boy Johnson, orchestrated a vast and profitable network of illegal activities. Their specialty was hijacking trucks from the John F. Kennedy Airport, a lucrative racket that provided a steady stream of high-value goods, electronics, clothing, cigarettes, that were quickly fenced through a network of connections. This was not petty theft. It was a sophisticated, logistical operation that required inside information, precise timing, and a willingness to use overwhelming force. Alongside hijacking, the Virgin crew ran extensive gambling operations with backroom card games and sports betting rings that generated massive cash flow. Loan sharking was another cornerstone of their empire. They would provide juice loans at exorbitant interest rates to desperate gamblers, small-time businessmen, and other individuals who found themselves outside the traditional banking system. The failure to repay these debts was met not with a lawsuit, but with broken bones, threats to family, or worse. It was a brutal form of banking with an absolute guarantee of repayment, despite the Cosa Nostra's official ban on drug trafficking. A rule put in place by the old guard to avoid the intense law enforcement scrutiny that narcotics attracted. Gotti and his inner circle, particularly the impulsive Angelo Ruggiero, were deeply involved in the harrowing trade. The profits from narcotics were simply too enormous to ignore, and this clandestine involvement would later plant the seeds for Gotti's most significant conflicts within the family. Throughout this decade, Gotti was not just an earner, he was an enforcer, a captain who led from the front. He was known for his volcanic temper and his hands-on approach to discipline. He was feared by his subordinates and respected by his rivals. He built a reputation as a man who kept his word, rewarded loyalty generously, and punished betrayal with savage finality. This duality, the devoted family man at home with his wife and children, and the merciless crime boss at the Virgin, defined him. He was cultivating not just power, but an image, a persona that was both terrifying and strangely compelling. The street was his stage, and every act of violence, every public display of confidence was a performance designed to build his legend. This relentless drive was fueled by an insatiable hunger for respect, a hunger that was born in the poverty of his youth, and that would ultimately dictate every major decision of his life, leading him to gaze up at the very pinnacle of the Gambino family and to covet the throne occupied by the man known as the boss of bosses, Paul Castellano. The ascent of John Gotti to the absolute apex of the Gambino crime family was not a slow, diplomatic climb. It was a violent, audacious coup d'etat born from a perfect storm of personal ambition, perceived slights, and a fundamental clash of cultures between the old guard and the new. The man standing in Gotti's way was Paul Castellano, known as Big Paul. Castellano was the boss, a man who had inherited the throne through his marriage to the sister of the previous boss, Carlo Gambino. He was a different kind of mafioso. While just as ruthless, Castellano preferred to operate from the shadows, conducting business in plush, private offices and upscale mansions on Staten Island. He saw himself as a businessman, a CEO of crime, and he looked down upon the flashy, street-level thuggery of men like Gotti and his mentor, Aniello Della Croce. This ideological rift was the primary fault line within the family. The tension was already palpable, but it escalated into an inevitable confrontation when Paul Castellano was indicted in 1985 on a massive racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations act case. Facing the possibility of life in prison, Castellano began to fear that his underlings, particularly the ambitious Gotti, would see him as weakened and make a move. He started convening meetings of the family's captains, deliberately bypassing the ailing Della Croce, whom he suspected of disloyalty. This was a grave insult, a violation of Mafia protocol that humiliated Delacroce and his faction. Simultaneously, Castellano had gotten wind of the Virgin crew's extensive involvement in narcotics trafficking, a direct violation of his strictest rule. He demanded transcripts of wiretapped conversations involving Angelo Ruggiero, Gotti's best friend and close associate, which he believed would provide the evidence he needed to have Gotti and his entire crew killed for their drug dealing. The noose was tightening from both the law and his own boss. The situation reached its boiling point with the death of Aniello Delacroce from cancer on December 2, 1985. Delacroce had been a buffer, a respected figure who had managed to keep Gotti's ambitions in check and placate Castellano's suspicions. With him gone, the path was clear for a direct and bloody conflict. Gotti saw Castellano's legal troubles and his move against the Virgin crew not just as a threat, but as the ultimate disrespect. He believed Castellano was going to have him murdered. In the high-stakes world of the Mafia, the only choice was to strike first. Gotti, along with his trusted underboss Sammy, the Bull, Gravano, and other loyalists, meticulously planned the assassination of Paul Castellano. They'd chose a time and place that would send the most powerful message possible in the heart of Manhattan, at rush hour, directly outside Sparks Steakhouse, one of Castellano's favorite restaurants, on the evening of December 16, 1985, as Paul Castellano and his newly appointed underboss, Thomas Bellotti, arrived for their dinner meeting. They were ambushed by a team of Gotti's hitmen. Shots rang out in the crowded street, and both men were executed in a hail of gunfire. The brazenness of the hit was unprecedented. This wasn't a back alley murder. It was a public execution of the most powerful crime boss in America, designed to demonstrate absolute power and instill terror. From that moment forward, there was no doubt who was in charge. John Gotti had not just committed a murder, he had seized a throne. And he did so with a flair for the dramatic that would come to define his entire reign. He was now the boss of the Gambino crime family, and he was determined to rule not from the shadows, but in the blinding glare of the spotlight. With the violent removal of Paul Castellano, John Gotti did not just assume a new title. He inaugurated a new era for the Gambino crime family and for the public perception of the American Mafia. His ascension was a hostile takeover that sent shockwaves through the underworld. But instead of retreating into secrecy, Gotti embraced a level of visibility that was utterly unprecedented for a Mafia boss. He understood the power of imagery and narrative, and he meticulously crafted his public persona, transforming himself from a feared gangster into a celebrity criminal. This was the birth of the Dapper Don. Gotti became a fixture on the New York social scene, always immaculately dressed in $2,000 hand-tailored Brioni suits, silk ties, and cashmere overcoats. His hair was perfectly coiffed, and he carried himself with a swagger that was part confidence, part defiance. He held court on the sidewalks of Little Italy, outside the Ravenite Social Club, which replaced the Virgin as his primary headquarters. There, he would greet well-wishers, sign autographs, and hold impromptu press conferences, always with a sly, mocking smile for the FBI agents who were constantly surveilling him from their parked cars. The public and the media were captivated. Here was a mob boss who didn't hide, he performed. He was charismatic, quotable, and visually striking, a stark contrast to the faceless, shadowy figures that had previously populated the public's imagination of organized crime. This brazen public relations campaign was complemented by a series of stunning legal victories that earned him his most famous nickname, the Teflon Don. The federal government, humiliated by the Sparks steakhouse hit, threw immense resources into building a case against him. His first major test came in 1987, a federal racketeering trial in Brooklyn. The case seemed strong, but through a combination of witness intimidation, jury tampering, a charge that was never proven but widely believed, and a brilliant, aggressive defense that painted the government's key witness as a liar, Gotti was acquitted on all counts. The courtroom erupted, and Gotti walked out a free man, giving a triumphant, dismissive wave to the cameras. This victory cemented his legend. He had seemingly beaten the invincible U.S. government. Another high-profile trial in 1990, this time for assault, also ended in an acquittal. With each victory, his aura of invincibility grew. He was untouchable. The charges simply wouldn't stick. Behind this glittering public facade, however, Gotti ruled his empire with an iron fist. He centralized power, demanding a cut from all the family's operations and dealing with any perceived disloyalty with swift and brutal violence. He was a micromanager, involved in everything from approving murders to settling disputes between low-level soldiers. His temper was legendary and terrifying. He could fly into a rage over a minor slight, and his capos lived in constant fear of his mercurial moods. This paranoid and autocratic style of leadership, while effective in the short term, began to sow seeds of resentment within his inner circle. Men who had risked their lives to put him in power, most notably his underboss Sammy Gravano, started to feel undervalued and threatened. Gravano, a prolific killer who had been instrumental in the Castellano hit, watched as Gotti took all the credit and the glory, while the constant media attention brought unbearable heat on all their operations. The very flamboyance that made Gotti a folk hero to some was making it impossible for the family to conduct its business discreetly. The FBI's surveillance intensified, and the pressure on the family's members became immense. The Teflon coating was still intact, but the relentless heat was beginning to find its cracks. The seemingly unbreakable armor of the Teflon Don, however, was not impervious. It was merely waiting for the right combination of pressure and precision to shatter. The relentless media circus that Gotti so enjoyed was, in fact, a double-edged sword, and with every triumphant headline, the resolve of law enforcement hardened into an obsession. The FBI, stung by its very public failures in the courtroom, launched an unprecedented campaign to bring Gotti down. They knew that traditional methods, turning low-level associates or relying on electronic surveillance from cars and street poles, were insufficient against a boss as cautious and insulated as Gotti had become. The breakthrough, the chink in his armor, came from a decision to go where no investigation had gone before, directly into the heart of his inner sanctum. In a bold and technically complex operation, the FBI managed to plant a listening device, not just near Gotti, but on him in the most private of spaces. They bugged the apartment above the Ravenite Social Club, a place they discovered Gotti used for his most sensitive conversations, far from the public posturing on the sidewalk below. More crucially, they also managed to bug a private room in the club itself. This was not the scattered, distant surveillance of the past. This was a direct wire into the strategic mind of the Gambino boss. For months, the devices recorded hundreds of hours of conversation. On those tapes, Gotti was not the charming, witty character from the newspapers. He was the raw, unfiltered, and brutally pragmatic CEO of a criminal corporation. He could be heard discussing murders, ordering acts of violence, settling disputes between his captains, and meticulously planning the family's criminal activities. He spoke openly about the Castellano hit, effectively confessing to his role in orchestrating it. He ruthlessly mocked and disparaged his own men, including his underboss Sammy Gravano, whom he referred to as a punk and whom he suspected of being greedy. The tapes captured the sheer scope of his criminal empire, from extortion and loan, sharking to labor racketeering and murder. This was the prosecution's dream. The boss was essentially testifying against himself. While the FBI was building this airtight electronic case, another, more human bomb was ticking within Gotti's own organization. His underboss, Sammy, the bull Gravano, the man who had stood beside him during the Castellano hit and helped him run the family, was growing increasingly disillusioned and fearful. Gotti's volatile temper and his habit of blaming others for the intense legal heat had created a climate of paranoia. Gravano, a man with his own formidable reputation and a long list of murders, began to fear that he was being set up to take the fall for Gotti's legal troubles, or worse, that he was being marked for death. The final straw for Gravano came when he learned the full extent of the evidence on the tapes, including Gotti's disparaging remarks about him. Facing the rest of his life in prison, Gravano made a calculation that would ultimately prove fatal to Gotti. He decided to break the sacred oath of Omert and cooperate with the government. He walked into a prosecutor's office and offered to testify against the man he had helped make king. His testimony would provide the narrative, the context, and the corroboration for the damning evidence captured on the tapes. The combination was devastating. The boss's own words, delivered by his most trusted lieutenant. The Teflon was about to be scraped away, not by a single charge, but by an avalanche of irrefutable evidence from within his own circle. The end for John Gotti began not with a dramatic shootout or a rival's bullet, but with the quiet, methodical turning of a key in a cell door. The case that federal prosecutors built against him was universally regarded as the most powerful in the history of organized crime prosecutions. A perfect storm of technological evidence and human betrayal that left no room for the jury tampering or witness intimidation that had saved him in the past. The trial of United States v. John Gotti et al. Commenced in the winter of 1992 in a heavily secured federal courtroom in Manhattan, a stage far more somber than the bustling streets of Little Italy where Gotti had once held court. The atmosphere was tense, electric with the understanding that this was the final act of the Teflon Don's reign. Presiding over the trial was Judge I, Leo Glasser, a no-nonsense jurist who would tolerate none of the theatrics that had characterized Gotti's previous legal battles. The prosecution team, led by dedicated federal attorneys, presented a case that was both simple and overwhelming. Its foundation was the hundreds of hours of secretly recorded conversations from the Ravenite Club. Day after day, the jury and the world listened to the real John Gotti, not the dapper figure from the newspapers, but a man casually ordering violence, gleefully discussing criminal schemes, and spewing venom about his closest associates on one tape. He could be heard authorizing the assault of a union official who had displeased him. On another, he detailed the intricacies of a loan sharking operation, and most damningly, he was heard discussing the murder of Louis de Bono, a Gambino captain he had ordered killed for simply avoiding a meeting. The voice on the tapes was arrogant, profane, and utterly self-incriminating. But the tapes alone, all powerful, were given their devastating context by the star witness for the prosecution salvator, Sammy the Bull Gravano. Gravano, looking calm and collected in a suit, took the stand and for days meticulously dismantled the myth of John Gotti. He detailed the coup against Paul Castellano, describing the planning and the execution with chilling clarity. He confessed to his own role in 19 murders, laying bare the brutal mechanics of the mafia in a way the public had never heard before. But most importantly, he directly connected Gotti to the crimes discussed on the tapes. He explained the conversations, identified the voices, and provided the motives. He painted a picture of Gotti as a greedy, paranoid, and incompetent leader whose flashy lifestyle had brought ruin upon the family. The defense, led by the flamboyant attorney Albert Krieger, mounted a vigorous attack, attempting to portray Gravano as a pathological liar who was sacrificing Gotti to save his own skin. They highlighted the 19 murders he had admitted to, arguing that such a man's word was worthless. They tried to challenge the authenticity of the tapes, but the evidence was simply too overwhelming. Gotti, for his part, sat mostly silent, his once confident smirk replaced by a grim, stony expression. He could see the walls closing in. The narrative of the Teflon Don, the man who could not be convicted, was collapsing in real time under the weight of his own words and the testimony of his most loyal lieutenant. The trial was not just about specific crimes. It was the complete unraveling of a carefully constructed legend, a public dissection of a criminal empire by the very men who had built it. After a relatively short deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. On April 2, 1992, John Gotti was found guilty on all 13 counts, including murder, conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, obstruction of justice, tax evasion, and illegal gambling. There was no triumphant wave for the cameras this time. The Teflon Don had finally been stuck. Judge Glasser, citing the sheer evil of his crimes, sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would die behind bars. He was remanded to the United States Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois, the most secure federal prison in the country at the time, designed to hold the nation's most dangerous and escape-prone inmates. For Gotti, a man who thrived on movement, attention, and control, it was a fate worse than death. The conviction and life sentence marked not merely an incarceration, but the systematic dismantling of a man whose identity was entirely built upon his power, his image, and his freedom. John Gotti was transported to the United States Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois, a facility renowned for its brutal lockdown-style regime, a stark and deliberate contrast to the vibrant streets of New York he had once dominated. Marion was designed to break the human spirit, and for a personality like Gotti's, it was a special kind of hell. Inmates were confined to their cells for 23 hours a day, with 1 hour of solitary recreation in a small, fenced cage. Human contact was minimal. The sounds of clanging steel and electronic locks replaced the lively chatter of the Ravenite Club. This was a world devoid of the adulation, the fine suits, and the public spectacle that had been his lifeblood. Cut off from the outside world, his control over the Gambino crime family evaporated almost instantly. The organization he had led with such an iron fist quickly splintered into factions, with younger, hungrier captains seizing power, unwilling to take orders from a boss who was effectively a ghost. His brother, Peter Gotti, would eventually attempt to lead the family, but the glory days were over. The government's success in convicting Gotti had a chilling effect on organized crime nationwide, proving that even the most powerful and protected boss could be brought down. Inside Marion, Gotti's health began to deteriorate. The stress, the confinement, and the lack of proper medical care took a toll. He was diagnosed with throat cancer, a disease that would slowly and painfully consume his final years, in a bitter twist of fate. The man known for his sharp tongue and commanding voice was now being robbed of his ability to speak. After several years in the unrelenting harshness of Marion, he was transferred to the United States Penitentiary in Springfield, Missouri, a federal medical center, as his condition worsened. Here, he underwent surgeries and radiation treatments, but the cancer was relentless. The once Dapper Don was now a gaunt, sickly figure, connected to tubes and machines, a shadow of his former self. The public glimpses of him during this period were shocking. The expensive suits were replaced by prison-issued hospital gowns. The perfectly styled hair was gone, and the defiant swagger had been replaced by the slow, pained shuffle of a dying man. His family, particularly his wife Victoria and his children, remained loyal, visiting when they could, but these encounters were filled with the anguish of watching a patriarch wither away in a cage. His son, John A. Jr. Gotti had followed him into the life of crime and would himself face a series of federal trials, a testament to the cyclical nature of the destruction Gotti's sister had set in motion. In his final months, Gotti was largely isolated, reflecting on a life that had soared to unimaginable heights only to crash into the deepest depths. On June 10, at the age of 61, John Joseph Gotti Jr. died of complications from throat cancer in the Springfield Prison Hospital. His death was not a dramatic, cinematic end fitting of a mob boss, but a quiet, clinical conclusion in a sterile room, surrounded not by loyal soldiers, but by prison guards and medical staff. The news reverberated around the world, prompting a flood of obituaries that recounted his meteoric rise and his spectacular fall. His body was returned to New York, and his funeral was a massive, media-saturated event, with thousands of mourners and onlookers lining the streets of Queens. It was a final, fleeting echo of the public spectacle he so loved, but it was a spectacle centered on a corpse, a definitive full stop to the story of the Teflon Don. The legacy he left behind was complex, a warning about the perils of hubris, a case study for law enforcement, a symbol of a bygone era of organized crime, and a tragic tale of wasted potential. For those who saw in him something more than just a vicious criminal. The death of John Gotti did not silence the debates about his legacy. It merely opened the final chapter in the long and complex narrative of his impact on the American criminal underworld and popular culture. In the immediate aftermath of his passing, the Gambino crime family, once the most powerful and feared criminal organization in the United States, was a shell of its former self. The era of the flamboyant, publicly recognized boss was effectively over. The new generation of mob leadership, having witnessed the catastrophic consequences of Gotti's high-profile reign, retreated deep into the shadows, adopting a low-profile, corporate-style model of management that prioritized secrecy and avoided the media spotlight at all costs. The family fractured into smaller, less disciplined crews, and its influence over the key economic sectors of New York City, construction, garbage hauling, the waterfront, waned significantly, though it did not disappear entirely. For law enforcement, Gotti's conviction and imprisonment represented a monumental, paradigm-shifting victory. The strategies perfected in his case, the relentless electronic surveillance, the aggressive use of the Raicho statute, and the cultivation of high-level cooperators like Sammy Gravano became the blueprint for dismantling organized crime families across the country. The myth of Omerta was shattered forever. Gravano had proven that even the most hardened underboss could be flipped, a lesson that continues to haunt the mafia to this day. Within his own family, Gotti's legacy was one of profound tragedy and relentless legal pursuit. His son, John A. Jr. Gotti, thrust into a leadership role he was ill prepared for, spent the better part of his adult life in and out of courtrooms, facing a series of federal racketeering trials that all ended in mistrials or hung juries before he ultimately pleaded guilty to lesser charges and served a lengthy prison sentence. The Gotti name, which his father had fought so hard to make synonymous with power and respect, had become a target, a curse that guaranteed intense scrutiny from the FBI for any family member who remained in the life. The psychological toll on the Gotti children was immense, living perpetually in the shadow of their infamous father. their lives a public spectacle of legal battles and personal struggles. In the broader cultural landscape, John Gotti became an enduring, if controversial, icon. He was immortalized in numerous books, documentaries, and Hollywood films, often romanticized as a charming anti-hero, a man of the people who defied the system. This portrayal, however, always glossed over the brutal reality of his crimes, the murders he ordered, the lives he destroyed, the families he shattered through his loan, sharping and violence. He was, for a time, a symbol of a certain kind of twisted American success story. The poor immigrant son who took what he wanted by force of will. But the final lesson of his life was a far more classical one. A cautionary tale about the intoxicating and ultimately destructive nature of hubris. His journey from the gritty streets of Brooklyn to the pinnacle of criminal power, and finally to a lonely death in a prison hospital, serves as a powerful reminder that no amount of wealth, notoriety, or public adulation can insulate a person from the consequences of a life built on violence and deceit. The Teflon had not just been scratched, it had been completely stripped away, revealing the fragile, flawed, and ultimately mortal man beneath the meticulously crafted legend. Beneath the dazzling surface of the Brioni suits and the defiant public smirks lay a profoundly complex and contradictory psychology, a mental landscape where towering ambition coexisted with deep-seated insecurities, and where a fierce, almost tribal loyalty could instantly curdle into paranoid vengeance. To understand John Gotti is to look beyond the criminal acts and into the mind of a man for whom the concept of respect was an all-consuming obsession, a driving force that dictated every significant action from his teenage years until his final days in prison. This was not merely a desire for deference. It was a pathological need for control and recognition, born from the humiliations of poverty and his father's perceived failures. His entire life became a performance, a relentless campaign to project an image of unassailable strength and invincibility. The immaculate clothing was a weapon, a deliberate signal that he was not a common thug, but a man of refinement and power, a king among peasants. The very public nature of his reign was a calculated gamble, a belief that by operating in plain sight, he could mock the authorities and cement his own legend, turning the FBI's surveillance into his personal paparazzi. This grand performance, however, masked a deep-seated paranoia. He trusted very few people completely, and even his closest allies like Sammy Gravano were never entirely safe from his suspicions. The tapes from the Ravenite Club reveal a man constantly on edge, questioning the loyalty of his captains, interpreting minor slights as signs of betrayal, and always preparing for the next war, both from rival families and from within his own ranks. His leadership style was intensely autocratic. He demanded absolute obedience and brooked no dissent, often ruling through fear rather than genuine respect. This created an environment of toxic sycophancy, where his subordinates were too afraid to tell him the truth, particularly that his very public persona was bringing unsustainable heat upon the entire organization. His intelligence was undeniable, but it was a street smart cunning intelligence, unrefined by formal education, and ultimately limited by his own ego. He could masterfully plan a criminal enterprise or a murder, but he lacked the strategic foresight to see that his flamboyant style was digging his own grave. He failed to understand that in the world of organized crime, longevity and success are derived from anonymity, not celebrity. His charisma was magnetic, but it was also a trap, luring him into believing his own myth of invincibility, the Teflon Don, persona that the media so eagerly propagated. This self-delusion was perhaps his greatest weakness. He began to believe that he could outsmart the entire federal justice system through sheer force of will, intimidation, and clever lawyers. He failed to appreciate the technological advancements in surveillance and the dogged persistence of a new generation of FBI agents who were not intimidated by his reputation. The very thing that made him a folk hero, his defiance, was the same thing that ensured his destruction. He was a classic tragic figure in the Shakespearean sense, a man of great power and stature brought low by a fatal flaw, which in his case was an overweening pride that blinded him to the gathering storm. He was a product of his environment, yet he also transcended it, becoming something larger than life, a symbol of a certain kind of ambition that refuses to be constrained by law or morality. His story continues to fascinate because it is a primal drama about the pursuit of power and the inevitable price that must be paid. A timeless narrative of rise and fall that plays out in the unlikeliest of settings. The mean streets of New York City, where a boy from the Fulton, Rockaway boys dreamed of becoming a king and for a brief, dazzling moment, believed he had achieved it. The empire that John Gotti commanded was, at its core, a vast and ruthless criminal corporation, a multi-million-dollar enterprise that preyed upon the very foundations of New York City's economic life. To view it merely as a collection of thugs and gangsters is to miss the sophisticated, if brutal, business model that generated immense wealth and power for the Gambino family. The revenue streams were diverse and deeply entrenched, a parasitic network that fed on both illicit desires and legitimate commerce. One of the most lucrative pillars was the family's stranglehold on the garment industry and the trucking hubs at John F. Kennedy Airport. Through a combination of violence, intimidation, and strategic corruption, Gotti's crews dominated the hijacking of trucks, stealing millions of dollars worth of goods that were then fenced through a network of warehouses and complicit businesses. This was not random theft. It was a highly organized operation that required inside information on shipping schedules, the cooperation of trucking company employees, and a distribution chain to move the stolen merchandise. Another colossal source of income was the network of illegal gambling operations. This included sprawling sports betting rings that took wagers from all over the city, high-stakes card games held in hidden back rooms, and illegal numbers rackets in poorer neighborhoods. The profit from gambling was steady and enormous, a cash business that was largely untraceable by the authorities. Closely tied to gambling was the practice of loan sharking, or providing juice loans. The family acted as brutal bankers, lending money at exorbitant interest rates, often point a week, meaning a 10,000 loan required a weekly interest payment of 100 to gamblers, small business owners, and individuals who had nowhere else to turn. Failure to make these big payments could result in broken limbs, the seizure of property, or death. This created a cycle of perpetual debt and fear that enslaved people to the family. Perhaps the most insidious and profitable venture, despite its official prohibition, was narcotics. While boss Paul Castellano had forbidden drug trafficking, Gotti and his crew, particularly Angelo Ruggiero, were deeply enmeshed in the heroin trade. The profits were simply too astronomical to resist, funding their lavish lifestyles and financing their war chest for the eventual coup against Castellano. Beyond these traditional rackets, the Gambinos under Gotti also exerted significant control over key labor unions, most notably the construction industry and the waterfront. By infiltrating these unions, they could extort massive payoffs from construction companies in exchange for guaranteeing labor peace, rig bids on major projects, and steal from union pension funds. This manipulation of the legitimate economy caused ripple effects, driving up costs for the entire city and corrupting the political process. The cash generated from all these ventures flowed upward, with captains and soldiers kicking back a significant percentage of their earnings to the administration. Gotti, as the boss, lived a life of extraordinary opulence, funded by this river of illicit cash. His handmade suits, his expensive cars, his large home in Howard Beach, all were paid for with money stained by blood, addiction, and fear. This financial empire was protected not by lawyers and accountants in the traditional sense, but by a wall of silence enforced by murder and the constant threat of violence. It was a system that functioned with chilling efficiency for years, but it was also inherently fragile, dependent on the fear it instilled and vulnerable to the one thing Gotti could not control: the technological might and relentless determination of the federal government, which eventually used the financial trails and the recorded discussions of this very criminal economy as the primary evidence to bring the entire enterprise crashing down. No king, not even a criminal one, rules alone, and the court of John Gotti was populated by a cast of formidable, ambitious, and ultimately treacherous characters whose fates were inextricably linked to his own. To understand the full arc of his story is to examine the lives of the men who stood beside him, whose loyalty he demanded, and whose betrayals ultimately sealed his doom. Foremost among them was Salvatore, Sammy the Bull, Gravano, a man whose legacy would become the dark mirror image of Gotti's own. Gravano was the quiet, efficient, and deadly underboss, a stark contrast to Gotti's flamboyance. Where Gotti craved the spotlight, Gravano operated in the shadows, a prolific killer who confessed to 19 murders and was the operational mastermind behind many of the family's most complex criminal schemes. He was the one Gotti relied upon to execute the audacious plan to kill Paul Castellano, and for years he was the steadfast, loyal lieutenant. But Gravano was also a proud man with his own ambitions and a keen understanding of the street. He watched with growing alarm as Gotti's very public reign brought unprecedented heat upon the family, making it nearly impossible to conduct business. The final fracture came when he heard the Ravenite tapes. Hearing Gotti mock him and blame him for their legal troubles. Facing a life sentence, Gravano made the cold, pragmatic calculation to break Omer, and his testimony provided the narrative that turned the FBI's recorded evidence into a death sentence for Gotti. His cooperation was the most devastating blow, a betrayal from within the innermost circle that shattered the myth of mafia loyalty forever. Then there was Angelo Ruggiero, Gotti's childhood friend, and a man of volatile and reckless temperament. It was Ruggiero's involvement in the heroin trade and the FBI's wiretap on his phone that first brought the intense scrutiny of Paul Castellano upon the Virgin crew. The transcripts of Ruggiero's drug-related conversations were what Castellano demanded to see. The very evidence he intended to use to sanction Gotti and his men. Ruggiero's carelessness was a primary catalyst for the coup that brought Gotti to power. But he was also a liability, a loose cannon whose actions continually endangered the organization. He died of natural causes in 1989 before he could see the full downfall of his oldest friend. Another key figure was Frank DeSicco, a respected captain who was a crucial ally in the plot against Castellano. It was DeSicco who was supposed to become the new underboss, but he was assassinated just months after the hit by a car bomb intended for Gotti, a revenge attack ordered by the remnants of the Castellano faction. His death was a significant blow, removing a stabilizing and intelligent force from Gotti's administration. And then there was the law enforcement side, the men who dedicated years of their lives to building a case against Gotti. FBI agents like Bruce Moe, who headed the Gambino squad, and prosecutors like John Gleason and Laura Ward, who meticulously pieced together the complex Raicho case, became Gotti's most persistent and ultimately successful adversaries. They represented the implacable force of the state, a force that could not be intimidated, bribed, or outmaneuvered in the long run. These individuals, the loyal friend, the deadly underboss, the reckless brother in arms, and the dogged agents of the law, were not mere footnotes in Gotti's story. They were active participants whose choices, ambitions, and weaknesses shaped the trajectory of his rise and dictated the velocity of his fall. They were the human elements in a drama of power, each playing their part in a tragedy that was as much about personal relationships as it was about organized crime. A stark reminder that in the end, even the most powerful Don is dependent on the men around him. And when their loyalty fractures, the throne itself crumbles into dust. The heavy crown of the Gotti name was not a burden borne by John Gotti alone. Its weight fell most crushingly upon his family, transforming their lives into a public spectacle of both privilege and relentless tragedy, a legacy that extended far beyond his own death and into the next generation. His wife, Victoria Di Giorgio, whom he married in 1962, stood by him with a stoic loyalty through his countless legal battles, his long incarcerations, and the very public unraveling of his empire. Her life a testament to the complex bonds that tie a family together even in the face of overwhelming darkness. But it was his children, particularly his sons, who were destined to walk the longest and most difficult path in his shadow, their identities forever defined by their father's notoriety. The eldest son, John Jr. Gotti, was thrust into a position of authority. He never truly sought following his father's life sentence in 1992. The family, in a state of shock and desperate to maintain its power, appointed the then 28-year-old as the acting boss, a title that proved to be more of a curse than an honor. Junior lacked his father's commanding presence, his street, smart cunning, and most importantly, his fear-inspiring reputation. He was, in many ways, a reluctant prince, inheriting a kingdom that was already crumbling under the weight of federal indictments and internal dissent. His reign was defined not by criminal triumphs, but by a seemingly endless cycle of prosecutions. He faced 4 separate racketeering trials between 1999 and 2009, each one a media circus that rehashed the sins of the father. These trials all ended in mistrials or hung juries, with prosecutors repeatedly arguing that Junior was continuing his father's criminal legacy, while the defense maintained he had left that life behind. The constant legal battles took a devastating toll on his health and his family life, and he ultimately pleaded guilty to charges related to racketeering and admitted his involvement in several crimes, serving 6 years in prison. The second son, Frank Gotti, who had died in a tragic childhood accident that led to the murder of John Favara, was a ghost that haunted the family, a permanent scar on John Gotti's soul and a catalyst for one of his most heinous acts of vengeance. The third son, Peter Gotti, also attempted to step into the leadership void after his brother Junior's legal troubles intensified, but his tenure was marked by further decline and his own eventual conviction and life sentence, effectively ending the Gotti bloodline's direct control over the Gambino family. The daughters, Victoria and Angel, lived their lives away from the direct criminal spotlight, but were nonetheless forever linked to the infamy of their name, their personal relationships and struggles becoming fodder for tabloids and documentaries. The story of the Gotti children is a profound exploration of nature versus nurture, of the immense pressure to conform to a legacy built on violence, and the desperate, often futile, struggle to escape it. Junior Gotti's life, in particular, became a decades-long courtroom drama where he was forced to repeatedly confront the ghost of his father, a man he both loved and whose legacy he seemed to desperately want to escape. The Gotti name, which John had fought so viciously to make synonymous with power and respect, had become an inescapable trap for his offspring, a brand that guaranteed a lifetime of surveillance, prosecution, and public scrutiny. It was the final, bitter irony of John Gotti's life. The empire he built to elevate his family name ultimately ensured that it would be remembered not for its power, but for its spectacular and multi-generational downfall. A cautionary tale about how the pursuit of a criminal legacy can consume not just one life, but an entire bloodline. The intricate and symbiotic relationship between John Gotti and the media was a defining force of his reign. a dangerous dance of mutual exploitation that first built his legend and then meticulously dismantled it in an era before the 24-hour news cycle and social media. Gotti possessed an innate, almost preternatural understanding of public relations and the power of imagery. He recognized that in a city like New York, perception could be as potent a weapon as a gun, and he masterfully manipulated the press corps that gathered outside his haunts, particularly the Ravenite Club. He presented them with a perfect character, the impeccably dressed, witty, and defiant underdog who was standing up to the mighty federal government. The media, always hungry for a compelling narrative and a charismatic character, eagerly embraced this portrayal. They christened him the Dapper Don, and, after his acquittals, the Teflon Don, titles that he wore like a crown. Newspaper front pages and television news segments were filled with images of him smirking at cameras, waving to crowds, and making quippy remarks that mocked the prosecutors and FBI agents who trailed him. This coverage transformed him from a feared gangster into a perverse folk hero, a symbol of resistance for those who felt disenfranchised by the system. For a time, he was the most famous gangster in the world, his celebrity status blurring the lines between news and entertainment, and in the process, obscuring the brutal reality of his vocation. He was selling a story, and the public was buying it. However, this media fascination was a double-edged sword. The very spotlight that fed his ego also illuminated his every move for the law enforcement officials who were building their case. The constant coverage created immense public pressure on the FBI and the Justice Department to secure a conviction, leading to the allocation of more resources, more agents, and a more determined effort to bug his inner sanctum. The media's portrayal of him as an untouchable king fueled the government's obsession with bringing him down. Furthermore, as his legal troubles mounted, the media narrative began to shift. The charming rogue image started to crack, revealing glimpses of the ruthless predator beneath. The coverage of his final trial was not about his suits and his smiles, but about the cold, hard evidence, the damning tapes of his own voice, and the shocking testimony of Sammy Gravano. The press that had once built him up now chronicled his fall with the same relentless energy, broadcasting the details of his crimes into millions of homes and ensuring his conviction was a public spectacle. In the end, the media proved to be a fickle ally. It provided the platform for his rise, but it also held the magnifying glass that focused the sun's heat upon him until he combusted. Gotti's story became a seminal lesson in the modern age of crime and celebrity, demonstrating how the media can create a monster and then, with equal fervor, tear it down, all in the pursuit of a story that captivates the public imagination, a cycle where the line between the newsmaker and the entertainment icon becomes irrevocably blurred, with consequences that are ultimately decided not in the court of public opinion, but in a court of law. The final trial of John Gotti was not merely a legal proceeding. It was a theatrical production of the highest stakes, a climactic battle between the state and the self-crowned king of the underworld. And the atmosphere in the federal courtroom was thick with a palpable tension that seemed to stifle the very air. Presiding Judge I, Leo Glasser, ran his courtroom with an iron grip, allowing no grandstanding, no outbursts, and no manipulation of the media from the defense table, effectively neutralizing the tactics that had served Gotti so well in the past. The prosecution, led by dedicated attorneys, presented its case with a methodical, relentless precision that built a wall of evidence brick by brick. The foundation of this wall was the hundreds of hours of audio recordings from the Ravenite Club, and day after day, the jury and the world were forced to listen to the unfiltered, brutal reality of John Gotti's reign. They heard his voice, cold and commanding, authorizing the murder of Louis de Bono for the sin of avoiding a meeting. They heard him casually discuss acts of extortion, plan the manipulation of labor unions, and spew profanity, laced diatribes against anyone he perceived as disloyal. This was not the charming Dapper Don from the newspapers. This was the raw, ugly engine of a criminal enterprise, and the effect on the jury was visibly profound. Then came the testimony of Sammy, the bull, Gravano, a moment in the trial that felt like a seismic shift. Gravano, once Gotti's most trusted lieutenant and the architect of countless murders, now sat calmly on the witness stand, a suit replacing his usual track suits, and for days he methodically dismantled the myth of his former boss. He described the plotting of the Castellano hit in chilling detail, confessed to 19 murders of his own, and provided the context that turned the disembodied voices on the tapes into a damning narrative of conspiracy, racketeering, and murder. The defense, led by the flamboyant Albert Krieger, mounted a vigorous attack, focusing almost exclusively on discrediting Gravano, painting him as a pathological liar and a mass murderer who was sacrificing Gotti to save his own skin. He's a killer, a mass murderer, and he's telling you stories to save himself, Krieger thundered. But the prosecution was ready for this, skillfully arguing that the only way to penetrate a criminal organization as vicious as the Gambino family was to use the testimony of those who were part of it, and that Gravano's confession of his own crimes only made his testimony more credible, as he had nothing left to hide. The closing arguments were a study in contrast. The prosecution meticulously walking the jury back through the mountain of evidence, connecting Gotti to each crime, while the defense appealed to emotion, begging the jury not to believe the monster, Gravano, Gotti himself, for perhaps the first time in a courtroom, seemed to sense the inevitable. The famous smirk was gone, replaced by a grim, stoic mask. He could feel the tide turning, the Teflon coating peeling away under the scorching heat of his own words and the betrayal of his underboss. The jury retired to deliberate, and the wait began. For days, the world watched. Then, on April 2, 1992, the jury returned. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on the jury foreman. Guilty, he said, on the first count of racketeering. And then again, and again, and again. 13 times in all for murder, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, tax evasion, and every other charge he faced. There was no outburst from Gotti. He simply sat there, the life draining from his face, as the weight of a lifetime of crimes finally settled upon him. The Teflon Don had been conquered. The legend was over. The verdict was not just a conviction of a man, it was the conviction of an era. A definitive statement that no one, not even the most flamboyant and seemingly untouchable crime boss, was above the law. The verdict of guilty was the shattering of the myth, but the sentencing was the formal entombment of the man, the moment where the full weight of the law descended to crush the life he had built. On June 23, 1992, John Gotti was brought back before Judge I. Leo Glasser for the final act of his legal drama. The courtroom was once again packed, but the mood was now funereal, a stark contrast to the electric anticipation of the trial. There would be no more acquittals, no triumphant waves. Prosecutor John Gleason stood and methodically outlined the sheer scope of Gotti's evil, describing him as a ruthless predator who had ordered murders, corrupted unions, and terrorized communities, a man who had lived a life of luxury funded by the misery of others. He spoke of the murder of Louis Di Bono, a man Gotti had ordered killed for simply being hard to find, and argued that Gotti's crimes represented a profound attack on the very fabric of society. He asked the judge to impose the maximum sentence possible, to ensure that John Gotti would never again walk the streets as a free man. When it was his turn to speak, Gotti, ever defiant even in utter defeat, refused to show remorse or admit any wrongdoing. He stood and, in a rambling statement, blamed the government for his predicament, accused them of using lies and a treacherous witness to frame him, and maintained his facade of wronged innocence. He told Judge Glasser, "I'm not guilty of these crimes. I'm an innocent man." But his words rang hollow in a room that had heard his own voice on tape detailing those very crimes. Judge Glasser, a jurist known for his intellectual rigor and lack of sentimentality, was unmoved. He looked down at the convicted kingpin and delivered a blistering rebuke, stating that the evidence had shown Gotti was the leader of a criminal organization that dealt in murder, robbery, extortion, narcotics, loan sharking, and corruption of public officials. He cited the sheer evil of his actions, particularly the cold-blooded murder of Di Bono, and then he passed the sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive years for the specific criminal acts. A symbolic gesture that ensured he would die behind bars. With the strike of a gavel, John Gotti's life as he knew it was over. He was immediately remanded into custody, his expensive suits exchanged for a prison jumpsuit. His destination was the United States Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois, the most secure federal prison in the nation, designed to hold the most dangerous and escape-prone inmates. Marion was not a normal prison. It was a permanent lockdown facility, a concrete and steel purgatory. Inmates were confined to their small, sparse cells for 23 hours a day, allowed out only for a single hour of solitary recreation in a small, fenced cage. Human interaction was virtually non-existent. Meals were slid through a slot in the door, and all movement outside the cell was done in shackles and under heavy guard. For a man like Gotti, whose identity was built on movement, social interaction, and control, This was a torture far worse than physical pain. The sounds of the city were replaced by the echoing clangs of steel doors and electronic locks. The adoring crowds were replaced by the grim faces of correctional officers. The King of New York was now inmate number 18261-053, a number in a system designed to break his spirit, a system from which there was no appeal and no escape. The empire he had built continued to crumble without him, and in the profound silence of his cell, the only thing left for John Gotti was the slow, grinding passage of time and the bitter taste of a final, absolute defeat. The initial years of John Gotti's life sentence at the United States Penitentiary in Marion were a profound and relentless assault on his very identity. A systematic deconstruction of the man who had once commanded an army of criminals from the bustling sidewalks of Little Italy. Confined to a cell measuring roughly 6 by 8 feet for 23 hours a day, the Dapper Don was now a caged animal, his world reduced to the monotonous routine of a high security inmate. The immaculate Brioni suits were a distant memory, replaced by a standard, issue-khaki prison uniform. The gourmet meals from New York's finest restaurants were now bland. Institutional food passed through a slot in his solid steel door. The constant adulation and fear he inspired on the outside were replaced by the impersonal, disciplined contempt of the prison guards, for whom he was just another number, another problem to be managed. This extreme isolation, known as administrative segregation, was designed to prevent any communication or coordination with the outside world, severing his last remaining threads of control over the Gambino family. The organization, which had already begun to fracture under the weight of the indictments and the loss of his public leadership, now spiraled into chaos and internecine warfare without its charismatic, if tyrannical, center. Inside Marion, Gotti's notorious temper and pride festered in the silence. He was known to argue with guards over minor infractions. His outbursts of futile attempt to assert some semblance of the control he had once wielded. He spent his hours reading newspapers, writing letters to his family, and dwelling on the betrayals that had landed him here, most notably that of Sammy Gravano. The psychological toll was immense, but it was the physical toll that would ultimately claim him. After several years in the unyielding harshness of Marion, he began to experience persistent health problems. A chronic cough worsened, and he complained of difficulty swallowing. Initially dismissed by prison medical staff as minor ailments, his condition steadily deteriorated. In 1998, after repeated requests and growing concerns, he was transferred to the United States Penitentiary in Springfield, Missouri, a federal medical center equipped to handle inmates with serious health issues. It was here, after a series of tests and biopsies, that he received the devastating diagnosis. He had squamous cell carcinoma, a form of throat cancer. The disease was located in his hypopharynx, a cruel irony for a man whose power had been so deeply connected to his voice and his commanding presence. The cancer was advanced, and the prognosis was poor. Thus began a long, painful, and very public battle with the disease. He underwent rigorous treatments, including radiation and multiple surgeries, One procedure involved a partial pharyngectomy and laryngectomy, which severely damaged his vocal cords, robbing him of his ability to speak in anything more than a painful, rasping whisper. The man who had held press conferences with a sly grin could now barely communicate. He was fed through a tube, and his once robust frame withered away to a gaunt shadow. The few photographs that emerged of him in his final years were shocking. They showed a frail, elderly man with a sunken face and a haunted look in his eyes, a stark and heartbreaking contrast to the vibrant, defiant figure who had dominated the front pages a decade earlier. His family, particularly his wife Victoria, advocated fiercely for his release on compassionate grounds, arguing that he was no longer a threat to anyone and deserved to die at home. But the Justice Department, remembering the sheer brutality of his crimes, remained unwavering. His petitions for release were consistently denied. He would die in prison, as the judge had decreed. His final years were a slow, agonizing retreat from the world, a prolonged goodbye witnessed only by prison guards, medical staff, and the occasional family visit, a solitary and undignified end for a man who had always believed he was destined for so much more. The final year of John Gotti's life was a protracted and painful surrender, a slow, motion-ebbing away of life force within the sterile, clinical confines of the prison hospital in Springfield. The once indomitable force of will that had defined him was now fully engaged in a losing battle against the inexorable spread of cancer, an enemy that could not be intimidated, bribed, or murdered. By the turn of the millennium, he was a ghost of his former self, his body ravaged by the disease and the aggressive treatments meant to combat it. His world had shrunk from the 5 boroughs of New York to the 4 walls of a medical cell, and then, finally, to the confined space of a hospital bed. He was largely bedridden, dependent on machines for nourishment and on powerful painkillers for any semblance of comfort. The vocal commands that had once ordered murders and moved millions of dollars were now reduced to a pain, inaudible whisper. A cruel and fitting punishment for a man whose power had been so deeply rooted in his voice and his words. His family, especially his wife Victoria and his children, maintained a vigil, visiting when possible. Their moments together overshadowed by the grim reality of his condition and the unyielding presence of prison guards. Their repeated, desperate appeals for compassionate release fell on deaf ears within the federal bureaucracy. The symbol of the Teflon Don's ultimate defeat was too powerful for the government to relinquish. He was to serve his full sentence, and that sentence ended only with his death. As the spring of 2002 arrived, it became clear that the end was near. The cancer had metastasized, spreading to his lymph nodes and other parts of his body. His systems began to fail. On the morning of June 10, in that sterile, impersonal room, surrounded not by loyal soldiers, but by the indifferent machinery of a state institution, John Joseph Gotti Jr. took his final breath. He was 61 years old. The news of his death traveled instantly, triggering a global wave of media coverage that recounted his spectacular rise and his even more spectacular fall. His body was returned to New York, and his funeral was arranged to be a final, grand public spectacle, a last echo of the life he had lived, held at the Papavero Funeral Home in Muspet, Queens. The service was a massive, chaotic event that mirrored the man himself. A blend of genuine grief, morbid curiosity, and blatant pageantry. Thousands of mourners and onlookers lined the streets, a mix of family friends, former associates, curious residents, and a massive press corps. The procession was led by a line of sleek, black limousines, and his casket was a lavish, bronze model worth thousands of dollars. Inside, he was dressed in an elegant, custom-made suit, a final nod to the Dapper Don persona. The eulogies praised him as a loyal friend and a devoted family man, deliberately ignoring the trail of blood and broken lives he had left in his wake. It was a scene straight out of a gangster film, a public display of power and respect from a community that had, for a time, viewed him as a hero. But beneath the surface glamour, the event was a funeral for an era. The powerful Gambino family was a fractured, weakened entity. The age of the flamboyant, celebrity mob boss was unequivocally over. His body was interred in a private crypt at St. John Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens, placed near the grave of his son, Frank, whose tragic death had set in motion one of the darkest chapters of Gotti's violent life. In death, as in life, John Gotti remained a figure of intense controversy and fascination, a man who had achieved everything he ever wanted and lost it all, his story serving as an enduring, cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of power and the inescapable reach of justice. The death of John Gotti did not simply mark the end of a man, it signaled the definitive end of a specific, flamboyant era in American organized crime and forced a fundamental restructuring of the mafia's very DNA for the 21st century. His reign and its catastrophic conclusion served as the ultimate case study for both law enforcement and the criminal underworld, a master class in what not to do if one sought longevity and power. For the mafia families, particularly the Gambinos, the lessons were harsh and clear. The model of the high-profile, media-savvy boss was now understood to be a suicide pact. The intense heat generated by Gotti's public persona had made it impossible to conduct business, led to unprecedented levels of electronic surveillance, and created an environment where flipping a high-level underboss like Sammy Gravano became a viable strategy for the government. In the years following his imprisonment and death, the Gambino family, along with the other 4 families, consciously retreated into the shadows. Leadership became more corporate, more anonymous, and far more decentralized. Bosses now operate like ghostly CEOs, their identities often unknown even to lower-level members for years at a time. They avoid the social clubs and sidewalk conferences that were Gotti's trademarks, preferring to communicate through encrypted devices and intermediaries. The focus shifted from the brazen, street-level rackets that attracted attention to more sophisticated, white-collar crimes like cybercrime, stock market manipulation, and complex frauds that were harder to detect and prosecute. The flashy suits and public bravado were replaced by a deliberate, studied blandness designed to be invisible. For law enforcement, the Gotti victory was a transformative event that validated a new, more aggressive playbook. The success of the Raicho statute in dismantling an entire criminal hierarchy proved its worth as the most powerful weapon in the legal arsenal. The strategy of going up the ladder by flipping high-level cooperators became standard procedure. The breaking of Omert by Gravano demonstrated that the code of silence was a myth that could be shattered with the right pressure. The technical and legal innovations used to bug the Ravenite Club set new precedents for surveillance. The FBI's Gambino squad became a model for how to run a long-term, intelligence-driven investigation against a complex criminal organization. In a broader cultural sense, Gotti's legacy is a fractured one. He remains a folk anti-hero to a segment of the population that sees in him a symbol of defiance against authority, a self-made man who came from nothing and for a time beat the system. This romanticized view, perpetuated by countless movies, television shows, and true crime podcasts, often glosses over the brutal reality of his actions. The murders, the lives destroyed by his lone sharking, the corruption he engendered. The other side of his legacy is that of a cautionary tale, a modern-day Icarus whose wings of hubris melted when he flew too close to the sun of his own celebrity. He is a reminder that in the digital age, where every conversation can be recorded and every associate is a potential government witness, the old model of the gangster as a public figure is not only obsolete but fatal. The Dapper Don's greatest and most enduring impact, therefore, may be that he made his own kind of criminal extinct, his spectacular flame-out serving as a warning so powerful that it forced the entire underworld to evolve into something quieter, more secretive, and in many ways more dangerous than ever before. As the dust settled on the tumultuous saga of John Gotti, what remained was not just the memory of his crimes or his celebrity, but a profound and enduring narrative that touches upon the most fundamental themes of the human condition. The intoxicating allure of power, the fragile nature of loyalty, the sting of betrayal, and the inescapable reach of justice. His life story transcends the specifics of organized crime and becomes a classical tragedy, a Shakespearean drama played out on the asphalt stage of New York City. The theme of power was the central engine of his existence. For Gotti, power was not merely a means to wealth. It was an end in itself, the ultimate validation of a boy from the slums who refused to remain invisible. He sought a power that was absolute and unquestioned, a power that manifested in the fear in a rival's eyes, the deference of a captain, and the adulation of a crowd. He understood that power was as much about perception as it was about reality, which is why he invested so heavily in his public image, crafting the persona of the Dapper Don to project an aura of invincibility and control. Yet, this relentless pursuit of power corrupted him utterly, isolating him in a fortress of his own paranoia and blinding him to the vulnerabilities his flamboyance created. Closely intertwined with power was the theme of loyalty, a concept he demanded with a fanatical zeal, but ultimately failed to reciprocate in a way that could sustain his reign. He built his empire on a foundation of personal loyalty, surrounding himself with men like Gravano and Ruggiero, who had proven their devotion through acts of violence and unwavering support. He operated within a subculture that preached Omert as a sacred oath, a bond stronger than blood. Yet, his own leadership style, characterized by volatile outbursts, public humiliation of his subordinates, and a tendency to blame others for his problems, systematically eroded that loyalty. He failed to understand that true loyalty is a two-way street requiring respect and preservation, not just demand and extraction. This failure directly gave rise to the theme of betrayal, the act that ultimately proved his undoing. The betrayal by Sammy Gravano was not a random act of treachery. It was the predictable consequence of Gotti's own actions. By creating an environment of fear and disrespect, he cultivated the very disillusionment that led his most loyal lieutenant to make a pragmatic choice for self-preservation. The betrayal was so devastating precisely because it came from within, proving that the fortress walls he had built were crumbling from the inside. And finally, overarching all of these, was the theme of justice. For years, it seemed that traditional justice could not touch him. He was the Teflon Don, against whom charges would not stick. But justice, in the end, was not denied. It arrived not in a single dramatic moment, but through the slow, meticulous, and relentless work of the legal system. It came in the form of advanced surveillance technology that captured his own voice, in the form of a Raicho statute designed to attack the entire enterprise, and in the form of a betrayed underboss who provided the context for the crimes. His life sentence and his lonely, painful death in prison served as a powerful, definitive statement that no one is above the law. The story of John Gotti, therefore, endures not because of the glamour, but because of the lessons. It is a timeless reminder that power gained through violence and fear is inherently unstable. That loyalty coursed is loyalty waiting to fracture, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, carries a weight that even the most powerful cannot forever resist. And so, the tale of John Joseph Gotti Jr. reaches its final, quiet conclusion. A story that began with a whisper of ambition in the crowded tenements of the South Bronx and ended with the silent, final breath of a dying man in a prison hospital bed. We have journeyed together through the entire arc of this complex and contradictory life, from his early days as a reckless street brawler with the Fulton Rockaway Boys, through his ruthless ascent up the Gambino family ladder under the wing of Aniello Delacroce, to the audacious and bloody coup that made him the boss. We witnessed the dazzling, self-constructed myth of the Dapper Don and the Teflon Don, a period of unparalleled notoriety where he seemed to mock the very justice system that sought to contain him. We saw the intricate machinery of his criminal empire, a vast network of hijacking, gambling, loan, sharking, and union corruption that fed his wealth and his legend. But we also saw the fatal flaws that were woven into the fabric of his character. The hubris, the paranoia, the volatile temper. Flaws that would inevitably lead to his downfall. We followed the relentless pursuit by law enforcement a pursuit that culminated in the damning evidence from the Ravenite Club tapes and the earth-shattering betrayal of his underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano. We sat in that courtroom as the guilty verdicts were read, one after another, stripping away the Teflon coating forever. We endured with him the grim reality of a life sentence in the nation's most secure prisons. A cruel existence of isolation and confinement that slowly eroded his spirit, and we witnessed the final, humbling chapter as throat cancer, a disease that stole the voice he had used to command and intimidate, consumed his body, leading to a lonely death far from the city he once ruled. This narrative, pieced together from historical records, court documents, and countless hours of testimony, was presented to you with a single goal: to provide a comprehensive and accurate account, to separate the man from the myth, and to understand the profound consequences of a life lived outside the law. The story of John Gotti is more than a biography of a gangster. It is a permanent part of the American tapestry, a stark illustration of the rise and fall narrative that has fascinated humanity for centuries. It is a story about the price of power, the fragility of loyalty, and the ultimate, inescapable nature of justice. If this deep dive into one of history's most captivating criminal minds held your attention, if you found value in this detailed exploration of truth behind the legend, then our mission has been accomplished. The channel is dedicated to unearthing such comprehensive stories, to bringing you the facts behind the headlines and the humanity behind the history. We have many more such tales to tell, stories of power, intrigue, crime, and consequence from all corners of the world and all pages of history. If you do not wish to miss them, please take a moment to support this effort. Subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you are notified the moment our next story is released. Share your thoughts on this narrative in the comments below. What aspect of Gotti's story did you find most compelling? Your engagement helps us continue this journey. Thank you for your time and your attention. This has been the story of the Dapper Don.